My daughter forgot I was still in the house. She thought I'd gone to my Thursday afternoon card game at the senior center, same as always. Same as I had every week for the past 3 years since Eleanor passed. But that Thursday, I'd come back early. Arthritis in my left hand had been acting up all morning. The kind of ache that makes holding a hand of cards feel like a punishment. So I'd driven home 2 hours ahead of schedule, come in through the side door off the garage, and settled into my old recliner in the den with a glass of water and the television on low. That's where I was sitting when I heard my daughter's voice drifting down the hallway from the kitchen, low and urgent, the way people talk when they're sure nobody else is listening. I heard her say, "Dad can't manage this place much longer. You know that. I know that. The question is how we make it happen before he figures out what we're doing." My name is Raymond Kowalski. I'm 67 years old. For 33 years, I drove a city bus in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Same routes, same faces, until my knees gave out and the pension kicked in. Eleanor and I built a life in this house on Sycamore Drive in Bethel Park for 36 years. We raised our daughter Kimberly and our son Daniel in the 2 bedrooms upstairs. I coached Little League on Saturday mornings and grew tomatoes in the backyard every summer until they outgrew the fence. Eleanor died 18 months ago from a stroke that came without any warning on a Tuesday morning in October. And after the funeral, I walked back into this house and felt the silence land on me like something physical, like a weight I hadn't been asked to carry but had no choice about. Kimberly lived 45 minutes away in Cranberry Township with her husband Todd and their 2 kids. She called regularly, came by on weekends, brought casseroles. I didn't always have the appetite for her. She seemed like the kind of daughter a man thanks God for. 3 months after Eleanor died, she and Todd came over together on a Sunday afternoon with a proposal that felt, in that moment, like exactly the thing I hadn't known I needed. "Dad," she said, sitting across from me at Eleanor's kitchen table, "this house is too much for one person. Todd and I have been talking. The commute from Cranberry is getting brutal for him anyway, and the kids would love being closer to you. What if we moved in? Just until we find the right place to buy. You'd have company, we'd help with the house, and nobody has to worry about you being here alone." I told her yes before Todd finished nodding along. I meant it completely. For the first 5 months, I thought I'd made the best decision of my retirement. Todd fixed the water heater when it started making that grinding sound. Kimberly replanted Eleanor's garden in the spring without me having to ask. The grandkids ate breakfast at my table on weekday mornings before school, and I drove them sometimes, the long way around past the old ball field. Same way I used to drive Kimberly when she was their age. I told my neighbor Vince next door that having family fill the house again was the only thing that had made the grief feel manageable. I believed it when I said it. I had no idea that, while I was sleeping soundly in the bedroom at the end of the hall, my own daughter was already in the planning stages of a decision that didn't include me. The first thing I noticed, if I'm being honest with you, was the way Kimberly started talking about the house differently. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a slow drift in the language she used. She started saying things like, "When we eventually list this place in passing," or asking Todd what he thought the neighborhood comps were running these days, almost like I wasn't there. When I asked her once what she meant by "list this place," she laughed and said she was just thinking out loud about the market in general, not anything specific. I let it go. I didn't want to be the kind of father who hears trouble in every sentence. Then came the doctor's appointments. Kimberly started coming with me to see Dr. Ferraro, my GP, who I'd been seeing for 20 years without needing anyone to hold my hand in the waiting room. The first time, she said she just wanted to understand my blood pressure situation better, and I thought that was considerate. The second time, she asked Dr. Ferraro, right in front of me like I was a piece of furniture, whether patients my age typically showed any early indicators of memory-related issues after the loss of a spouse. Dr. Ferraro looked at me before she answered, and I gave him a small shake of my head that I hoped conveyed everything I couldn't say out loud in that room. Memory-related issues. I had driven the same bus routes in Pittsburgh for 33 years, without missing a single turn. I could name every player on the 1,979 Pirates World Series roster from memory. My mind was fine. My mind was better than fine. But Kimberly kept at it. Gently, always gently. She started leaving sticky notes on the refrigerator to help me remember things I hadn't forgotten. She took my car keys off the hook by the door one morning and put them somewhere else, telling me she'd just moved them while cleaning, but I couldn't find them for 2 days. She started a conversation at dinner one night about a woman from her office whose father had moved into a place called Creekside Manor, and how surprisingly lovely it was, how the rooms were spacious and the staff were wonderful, how the man had seemed resistant at first, but now he loved it. I sat across the dinner table and ate my chicken and said that sounded very nice for that man, and I watched Todd stare at his plate, and I understood. With the particular clarity that comes from having spent 33 years reading the body language of strangers on a city bus, that this was not a casual story about a coworker's father. 2 weeks later, I left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter by accident and came back for them to find Kimberly on the phone, standing at the window over the sink, speaking quietly into the receiver. I came through the hallway slowly, the way you walk in your own house when you're in no particular hurry, and I heard her say, "He left his glasses in the kitchen again. Last week it was the remote. I'm telling you, Todd, it's getting worse. We need to move on this before summer. The house is worth at least 800,000 the way the South Hills market is running right now. Maybe more if we do the deck before we list. I talked to my cousin Patricia. She says if we get the power of attorney signed before anything else, the rest is straightforward. Dad trusts me. That's the part that makes this actually workable. Dad trusts me. I stood in that hallway for a long time. I did not move, and I did not make a sound. My heart was doing something in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Not quite anger, deeper than anger. The specific grief of hearing something in your child's voice that you recognize as a version of yourself, the practical tone, the problem-solving tone, the let's figure this out before it becomes complicated tone, and realizing she learned that from you, and she is now using it to plan your removal from the only home you have left. I went back to the den. I sat in my chair. I turned the television on, but I didn't see anything on the screen for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that chair that evening, because I think some of you listening have felt some version of it, and you deserve to hear it named plainly. It wasn't rage. It was closer to the feeling of the ground shifting under you, not falling exactly, just the sudden awareness that what you were standing on was not what you thought it was, that the arrangement that had felt like love had actually been a strategy, and that the strategy had been running quietly in the background for months, while I drove my grandkids to school and grew tomatoes and made coffee in the morning, thinking I was living in my own home with people who loved me. My first instinct was to walk into that kitchen and ask my daughter directly what exactly she had meant. But something in me, the same part that spent 33 years watching people and knowing which passengers on the late route were going to cause trouble before they opened their mouths, told me to wait, to be still, to learn exactly how far along things were before I said a single word. So I did the thing I should have done the moment she started accompanying me to Dr. Ferraro's office. The following Tuesday, when Kimberly had taken the kids to their soccer clinic and Todd was at work, I drove myself downtown to see a man named Gerald Hutchins, an elder law attorney whose office was on the third floor of a building on Liberty Avenue that I'd walked past 100 times driving my route back in the day. An old customer from my bus had mentioned him once when his own family had tried something similar. I'd kept the name in the back of my mind, the way you keep things you hope you'll never need. I sat across from Gerald Hutchins and told him everything. The phone call in the hallway, the doctor's appointments, Creekside Manor, the power of attorney Kimberly had mentioned to Todd. Gerald listened without interrupting, wrote a few things on a legal pad, and then asked me one question before he said anything else. "Mr. Kowalski, has your daughter asked you to sign any documents recently? Anything described as financial planning, estate organization, updated insurance, anything along those lines?" And I remembered it exactly then. About 10 days earlier, Kimberly had set a small stack of papers on my desk in the den and told me they were updated beneficiary forms for the homeowner's insurance that my policy provider apparently required every few years now. She'd put a sticky note on the top sheet with 2 arrows pointing to the signature lines. She'd said I could just sign when I got a chance, no rush. She'd mail them in. I hadn't signed them. I'd set them under a magazine because I never signed documents without reading them thoroughly, and I hadn't gotten around to it. Gerald Hutchins looked at me steadily when I told him this. "I'd like you to bring those papers in as soon as possible," he said, "before anything else." I brought them in the next morning. Gerald called me that same afternoon. They were not beneficiary forms. They were a financial power of attorney, a healthcare proxy, and a document that would have given Kimberly the legal authority to sell real property on my behalf if a single physician certified that I was experiencing cognitive difficulties managing my own affairs. 3 documents. All of them together would have handed my daughter legal control over my home, my money, and my medical decisions before I had the first sign of anything wrong with me. I sat in my truck in Gerald Hutchins's parking lot after that call for 20 minutes before I drove home. I want you to understand something about that 20 minutes. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I was thinking with a clarity I hadn't felt since the last day I drove my route. That particular alertness that comes when you realize the road ahead requires your full and complete attention. Gerald connected me with a woman named Susan Park, a realtor he said he trusted without reservation, who worked independently out of a small office in Mount Lebanon and had helped several of his clients navigate exactly this kind of situation. I met Susan at a coffee shop in Castle Shannon on a Wednesday morning when Kimberly thought I was at my follow-up with Dr. Ferraro. Susan was efficient and calm, and she did not ask me unnecessary questions. She told me that a four-bedroom house on a corner lot in Bethel Park with a finished basement and a recently updated kitchen was in exceptionally strong demand in the current market, and that if we moved with some discretion, she expected to have serious offers within 2 weeks. I opened a new checking account at a credit union in Dormont that same afternoon, one that Kimberly had no knowledge of and no connection to. I had my mail rerouted to a post office box Gerald's office had helped me set up. I started meeting Susan on Wednesday mornings, the way you meet someone when the work requires privacy. Cash for coffee, cell phone on silent, nothing written down on anything that stayed in the house. Here's the part I want you to hear, because I know some of you are going to wonder how I sat across from my daughter at dinner every night during this period and kept my face completely neutral. The answer is that I had 33 years of practice keeping my expression steady while people did and said all kinds of things in the seats behind me. You learn quickly on a city bus that the worst thing you can do when something is happening is let people know you've noticed. You just drive. You watch the road. You know exactly what's going on 3 rows back, and you do not flinch. So, I ate dinner. I watched football with Todd on Sundays. I drove the grandkids to school on Tuesdays. I let Kimberly bring up Creekside Manor a second time, nodding thoughtfully like a man who was warming to the idea. And I watched her exchange a small, satisfied look with Todd across the table that she didn't think I could see. I could see it perfectly. I filed it away without a word. Then Kimberly told me she and Todd were going to her college roommate's wedding in Savannah, Georgia. 5 days, leaving on a Thursday, back on a Monday. She asked me 3 times if I'd be all right on my own, with the particular, careful emphasis of someone checking a box. I told her of course I would. I told her to have a wonderful time. I stood on the front porch and watched Todd load the car. The moment their taillights disappeared around the corner onto Maple Grove Road, I sat down on the front steps for exactly 2 minutes. Then I went inside and called Susan Park. Let's close this week, I told her, while they're gone. The closing happened on a Friday afternoon in a conference room at a title company in Bethel Park, 3 miles from the house on Sycamore Drive. The buyers were a couple named Eric and Monica Walsh. Teachers, late 30s, their youngest starting kindergarten in the fall, who had fallen in love with the yard and the school district and the particular way the afternoon light came through the kitchen windows at 4 o'clock. Monica cried a little when she shook my hand. I told her Eleanor would have liked them very much. I meant that sincerely. The final number was $822,000 after fees, more money than I had ever touched at one time in my life. I had already made my next arrangement entirely on my own terms. There was a condominium community in Upper St. Claire called Ridgeview Commons, 12 minutes from where Daniel lived with his family, with a fitness center and a wood shop and a walking trail along the back that ran beside a creek. I had toured it twice alone in March, once in the afternoon and once in the morning to see how the light sat. The unit I wanted was a corner unit on the 3rd floor with windows on 2 sides. I bought it outright. Nobody suggested it to me. Nobody handed me a brochure with soft lighting and actors pretending to be happy. I walked through it myself, decided myself, and wrote the check myself with a hand that did not shake once. I had hired 2 movers I'd used when Daniel moved his apartment years ago. They were at the house at 7 in the morning the day after closing, and by 4 in the afternoon everything that mattered had been moved. Eleanor's china, the photographs, my father's workbench tools, the grandkids' crayon drawings I'd kept in a folder in the desk drawer. I left the furniture Kimberly and Todd had brought when they moved in, along with a storage unit key on the kitchen counter and the address of the public storage on Route 19, where I'd put everything else that belonged to them, prepaid for 60 days. Before I walked out of that house on Sycamore Drive for the last time, I sat for a few minutes at the kitchen table where I'd eaten 36 years of breakfasts. Then I wrote a letter on the yellow legal paper I'd always kept in the top drawer. I was not angry when I wrote it. I was something quieter than angry and something heavier than sad. And I tried to let it be both of those things without letting it be cruel. Because whatever Kimberly had done, she was still my daughter, and I was still her father. And I did not want the last thing I wrote to her from that house to be something I would be ashamed of later. I told her I'd heard the phone call in the hallway. I told her I knew about the papers she'd described as insurance forms, and I knew what those papers actually were, and I knew what she and Todd had planned to do with them once I'd signed. I told her the house had been sold, legally, with proper representation, to a family that would love it the right way. I told her the storage key on the counter was for a unit holding everything of hers and Todd's, that the rent was covered through the end of the summer, and that I was not putting her in a position of being homeless, even though she had been entirely comfortable putting me in one. I told her that I was not writing this letter to punish her, but because I thought she deserved to hear the truth plainly, the same way I had always tried to tell her the truth plainly her whole life. I told her I didn't understand, and that I probably never fully would. How the little girl I drove to school and coached through two broken hearts and helped move into her first apartment had become someone who looked at her father and saw a problem to be managed before he figured out what was happening. I told her I was healthy. I was sharp. I still remembered every street on my old route, every face I'd driven for years, and I was going to be just fine. And I told her that the door was not closed forever. Not if she could honestly reckon with what she'd tried to do and talk to me, like I was a person she respected, instead of a property dispute she was trying to get ahead of. I signed it. Love, Dad. Then I locked the door for the last time with the key I handed over to Susan Park on the front steps, got into my truck, and drove away without looking back once. Kimberly and Todd came home from Savannah on a Monday evening. My neighbor Vince watched it from his driveway. He called me later that night and told me the whole thing. He said they pulled up around 6:30, looking relaxed, Todd carrying Kimberly's suitcase up the front walk, Kimberly digging in her purse for her keys before she'd even cleared the gate. He said she found the right key on the first try, same key she'd always used, and it simply would not turn. She tried it twice more, then knocked, which he said looked strange. A person knocking on what they believed to be their own front door. Eric Walsh answered. He was holding a half-eaten sandwich and wearing a Pittsburgh Penguins shirt, and he looked at Kimberly with polite confusion and asked if he could help her with something. Vince said Kimberly's face did something complicated that he didn't have quite the right word for. Todd looked over her shoulder at a house full of furniture he'd never seen before and at a man he'd never met eating a sandwich in the entryway and said something Vince couldn't make out. Kimberly looked down then and saw the envelope taped at eye level on the doorframe, her name written on the front in my handwriting. The same handwriting that had signed her report cards and her birthday cards, and the check I wrote when she bought her first used car at 22. Vince said she read it standing right there on the front porch. He said halfway through, she sat down on the top step and kept reading. He said Todd read it after her, standing over her shoulder, and when he finished, he said her name once, quietly, and she didn't respond. He said there was no screaming. He said it was quieter than he expected, and that the quiet of it was somehow harder to watch than noise would have been. My phone rang 37 minutes later. I did not answer it. Over the next 4 days, Kimberly called 19 times and left 6 voicemails. Daniel called 3 times, and I answered his calls because Daniel had nothing to do with any of it, and I told him what had happened plainly and without exaggeration, and I listened to the long silence on his end, and I told him I loved him and that I was genuinely all right and that I was asking him not to get in the middle of it. He respected that. On the 5th day, I answered when Kimberly's name came up on my phone. I was sitting on the small balcony at Ridgeview Commons watching a pair of geese move down the creek trail in the early morning light. Coffee going warm in my hands, more settled than I had felt in longer than I could properly account for. She cried before she said anything. I let her. Then she said she was sorry. She said it twice, and I could tell she meant it, at least partially, and partial is what you start with, so I listened to all of it. She said they had been scared. She said the mortgage on the Cranberry Township house was worse than she'd let on, and Todd had lost a client that accounted for 1/3 of his income, and she'd started doing math in her head late at night the way frightened people do, and the math had led her somewhere she should have. Stopped walking before she got there. I told her I understood being scared. I told her I did not understand choosing to solve your fear by manufacturing evidence that your father was losing his mind and then trying to get him to sign away his own life while he was still fully in possession of it. She didn't argue with that. I was glad she didn't. I told her I was not in Creekside Manor. I told her I was in a corner unit on the third floor of a building I had chosen myself, with a woodshop downstairs and a creek out back and neighbors my own age who played cards on Wednesday evenings, and none of whom had ever suggested I was forgetting things I hadn't forgotten. I told her the money from Sycamore Drive was mine and would remain mine, managed by a financial planner Gerald Hutchins had recommended, and that I had also revised my estate documents with Gerald, in case she was wondering, and that everything was now in proper and legally airtight order. She asked if she could come see me. I told her not yet. I told her yet was still possible, but not yet. After I hung up, I sat there for a while with the empty coffee cup, and the geese were gone, and the creek was just moving quietly over the rocks the way it does, regardless of whatever is happening on the banks above it. My neighbor from down the hall, a retired postal worker named George, who I'd been playing cards with on Wednesdays for 2 months, knocked on the slider door and asked if I was joining the group for breakfast. I told him, "Give me 5 minutes." He said, "Take 10 if I needed it, no rush at all." I sat for 5. Then I went inside, put on a decent shirt, and went down the hall to have breakfast with people who were glad to see me walk in the door. If you made it to the end of this, then you already know something that I think a lot of people spend a long time figuring out, that the loneliest you will ever feel is not the silence after the funeral. The loneliest you will ever feel is sitting across the dinner table from someone you love, listening to them make plans for your life that you were never meant to hear, and keeping your face completely still. What comes after that quiet? When you finally decide to stop being the person other people plan around and start being the person who makes his own plans. That part, I want to tell you, is something else entirely.